The Doctrine of Fascism, written by Benito Mussolini, co-written by Giovanni Gentile. Like all sound political conceptions, fascism is action and it is thought, action in which doctrine is immanent, and doctrine arising from a given system of historical forces in which it is inserted, and working on them from within. It has therefore a form correlated to contingencies of time and space, but it has also an ideal content, which makes it an expression of truth in the higher region of the history of thought. There is no way of exercising a spiritual influence in the world as a human will dominating the will of others, unless one has a conception of both of the transient and the specific reality in which that action is to be exercised, and of the permanent and universal reality in which the transient dwells and has its being. To know men, one must know man, and to know man, one must be acquainted with reality and its laws. There can be no conception of the state which is not fundamentally a conception of life, philosophy, or intuition, system of ideas evolving within the framework of logic or concentrated in a vision or a faith, but always, at least potentially, an organic conception of the world. Thus, many practical expressions of fascism, such as party organization, system of education, and discipline, can only be understood when considered in relation to its general attitude towards life. Spiritual attitude. Fascism sees in the world not only those superficial, material aspects in which man appears as an individual, standing by himself, self-centered, subject to natural law, which instinctively urges him toward a life of selfish, momentary pleasure. It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country. Individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions and a mission, which suppressing the instinct of life, close in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life, founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. The conception is therefore a spiritual one, arising from the general reaction of the century against the materialistic positivism of the 19th century, anti-positivistic but positive, neither skeptical nor agnostic, neither pessimistic nor supinely optimistic, as are, generally speaking, the doctrines, all negative, which place the center of life outside man, whereas by the exercise of his free will, man can and must create his own world. Fascism wants man to be active and to engage in action with all his energies. It wants him to be manfully aware of the difficulties besetting him and ready to face them. It conceives of life as a struggle in which it behooves a man to win for himself a worthy place, first of all by fitting himself, physically, morally, and intellectually, to become the implement required for winning it. As for the individual, so for the nation, and so for mankind. Hence the high value of culture in all its forms, artistic, religious, and scientific, and the outstanding importance of education. Hence also the essential value of work, by which man subjugates nature and creates the human world, that being economic, political, ethical, and intellectual. This positive conception of life is obviously an ethical one. It invests the whole field of reality, as well as human activities which master it. No action is exempt from moral judgment. No activity can be despoiled of the value which a moral purpose confers on all things. Therefore, life, as conceived by the fascist, is serious, austere, religious, and its manifestations are poised in a world sustained by moral forces and subject to the spiritual responsibilities. Put it simply, the fascist disdains an easy life. The fascist conception of life is a religious one, in which man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective, while transcending the individual and raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. Those who perceive nothing beyond opportunistic considerations in the religious policy of the fascist regime fail to realize that fascism is not only a system of government, but also, and above all, a system of thought. In the fascist conception of history, man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, the nation, and in function of history to which all nations bring their contribution. Hence the great value of traditions, in records, in language, in customs, in the rules of social life. Outside history, man is a nonsensity. Fascism is therefore opposed to all individualistic abstractions based on 18th century materialism, and it is opposed to all Jacobinistic utopias and innovations. It does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth as conceived by the economic literature of the 18th century, and it therefore rejects the theological notion that at some future time the human family will secure a final settlement of all its difficulties. This notion runs counter to experience, which teaches that life is in continual flux and in the process of evolution. In politics, fascism aims at realism. In practice, it desires to deal with only those problems which are the spontaneous product of historical conditions and which find or suggest their own solutions. Only by entering into the process of reality and taking possession of the forces at work within it can man act on man and on nature. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only in as so far as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscious and universal will of man as a historic entity. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism, on the other hand, reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. And if liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. No individuals or groups outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but class struggle. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon. But when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. Grouped together according to their several interests, individuals form classes. They form trade unions when organized according to their several economic activities. But first and foremost, they form the state, which no mere matter of numbers, the sum of the individuals forming the majority. Fascism is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates a number to the majority, lowering it to the level of the largest number. But it is instead the purest form of democracy, if the nation be considered, as it should be, from the point of view of quality rather than quantity. As an idea, the mightiest become the most ethical, the most coherent, the truest, expressing itself in a people as the conscience and the will of the few, if not indeed of one, and the ending to express itself in conscience and will of the mass, of the whole group, ethnically molded by natural and historical conditions into a nation, advancing as one conscience and one will, along the self-same line of development and of spiritual formation. Not a race, nor a geographically defined region, but a people, historically perpetuating itself, a multitude unified by an idea and imbued with the will to live, the will to power, self-consciousness, and personality. Insofar as it is embodied in a state, this higher personality becomes a nation. It is not the nation which generates the state. This is an antiquated naturalistic conception which afforded a basis for 19th century publicity in favor of national governments. Rather, it is the state which creates the nation, conferring volition and therefore real life on a people made aware of their moral unity. The right to national independence does not arise from any merely literary and idealistic form of self-consciousness, still less from a more or less passive and unconscious de facto situation, but instead from an active, self-conscious, political will expressing itself in action and ready to prove its rights. It arises, in short, from the existence, at least in theory, of a state. Instead, it is the state which, as the expression of a universal ethical will, creates the right to national independence. A nation, as expressed in the state, is a living ethical entity only insofar as it is progressive. Inactivity is death. Therefore, the state is not only authority which governs and confers legal form and spiritual value on individual wills, but it is also power which makes it felt and respected beyond its own frontiers, thus affecting practical proof of the universal character of the decisions necessary to ensure its development. This implies organization and expansion, potential, if not actual. Thus the state equates itself to the will of man, whose development cannot be checked by obstacles and which, by achieving self-expression, demonstrates its own infinity. The fascist state, as a higher and more powerful expression of personality, is a force, but a spiritual one. It sums up all the manifestations of the moral and intellectual life of man. It cannot therefore be limited to those enforcing order and keeping the peace, as liberal doctrine might have it. It is no mere mechanical device for defining the sphere within which the individual may duly exercise his supposed rights. The fascist state is an inwardly accepted standard and rule of conduct, a discipline of the whole person. It permeates the will no less than the intellect. It stands for a principle which becomes the central motive of man as a member of civilized society, sinking deep down into his personality. It dwells within the heart of the man of action and of the thinker, of the artist and of the man of science, soul of the soul. Fascism, in short, is not only a lawgiver and a founder of institutions, but an educator and a promoter of spiritual life. It aims at refashioning not only the forms of life, but their content, man, his character, and his faith. To achieve this purpose, it enforces discipline and uses authority, entering into the soul and ruling with undisputed sway. Therefore, it has chosen as its emblem the lictor's rods, the symbol of unity, strength, and justice.